Thank you, everybody.
Well, welcome everyone. We're really excited that you're here with us today to talk about intersectionality. Before we start, I'm going to introduce myself and let the panelists introduce themselves. I'm Sarah Stevens. I'm the Director of Advising for the College of Nursing and Health Professions at University of Southern Indiana. As you can see from the title on this slide, our talk is centered around the concept of intersectionality, which is the study of our overlapping and intersecting identities. Drew, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hey everyone, I'm Courtney Drew. I go by Drew. After 8 years of working in higher ed, I now work at Rotary International headquarters as the analysis and pre-convention specialist. And because that probably only means anything to me and maybe one other person on this call, let me unpack it for you real quick. I work with the programs for young leaders there, which means that I help our emerging leaders with their leadership development and networking skills. And I think that that probably sounds pretty familiar to most of the people on the call. Craig?
Hi, y'all. I am an academic advisor for the Department of English at Florida International University in sunny Miami.
Awesome. Well, thanks, everyone. So we're going to be showing you the roadmap of our chat today. Our goal today is to provide both an overview of the main theories and to also challenge you to think about the ways you can incorporate the knowledge about intersectionality into your own advising practices. We're going to be asking you to think about your own identity factors throughout the next 60 minutes and to do a quick reflections about how these factor into your daily life. And as you've heard several times today, we encourage you to share your thoughts about this panel on Twitter and your questions. Use that hashtag NACADAweb, and we'll be monitoring throughout the broadcast, and we'll get to all of your questions and comments when we can. And if we don't have time now, we'll follow up after the webinar.
So intersectionality is defined as the study of our overlapping and intersecting social and biological identities. Sounds easy enough, right? We all know that we are made of many different identities, so the fact that these intersect and overlap should be common knowledge. And to an extent, it is. You do already know this, but because these intersections look so different for each of us, it's easy to gloss over the complexity in favor of the simplification. Let's take the three of us as examples.
Okay, so here's a picture of us with Wendy Schindler, which we presented, or who we presented with on this topic at NACADA in Vegas. Wendy, we totally love you and we miss you as well. Now, let's just for a minute say that we are 4 of your advisees. Now, that makes you pretty lucky. What I want you to do right now is write down a few of your first impressions of us as you are looking at this photo. Now, I'm going to refer to these as snap judgments. These are totally normal and very natural, so please don't pretend that you're not already doing it. Just write down what you're thinking in your brain right now. Just go with us. We promise we'll make it easy. Okay, so now let's take a look at the deeper picture. Meet Sarah.
Hey folks, as you already know, I'm Sarah, and these are some of my identity factors, some of which might be obvious when you see me or meet me, and some of which you might not know. So the first thing is that I am white. I'm a white anti-racist ally. I am cisgendered, which means that my gender identity matches the gender I was assigned at birth, if you're not familiar with that term. I am a feminist. I'm a secular humanist, which means that I'm not a religious person, which can sometimes be a struggle in the area of the country that I live in, which is, as I said before, Southern Indiana. I'm middle class, highly educated. I am married to a man, but I do identify as bisexual. Most people, when they first meet me or when they learn about my family, assume that I'm straight because I am married to a man. I'm a mom of 3. And I mostly appear able-bodied, and in fact I am mostly able-bodied, but I actually have a couple of hidden disabilities. First of all, I have PTSD because of an apartment fire during grad school, happened in the night, and I almost died from that. So I have PTSD, which kind of colors some of my reactions to different stimuli in my environment, and it's something you might think I'm just kind of off or something's weird about me unless you know that it is because of my PTSD. I'm also a cancer survivor. I had thyroid cancer closer. So if we were in person, I might show you the scar on my neck, but since it's a small picture, you probably can't see it. And again, that's something you might not know about me from just looking. I am a board game geek, total fan of gaming. I'm a writer, and I'm an artist. And so none of those things would be apparent from the surface. So Craig, let's get to know you a little bit better.
Hi, I'm Craig. I am a cisgender gay male. I'm white, and I'm from middle class from the Midwest. I'm an academic, and I identify as a staunch feminist. I'm also an orphan, and that shapes many of my life experiences as well. I'm single, I'm temporarily able-bodied, and I'm uncle to 3 of the most beautiful girls in the world. Drew.
So like Craig and Sarah, I identify as white. I also call myself all sorts of queer. And by that, I mean that I identify as queer as my sexual orientation, and I identify as genderqueer as my gender identity. Now, because some of you may not be familiar with that term, I just wanted to take a quick moment to explain it. Now, no two people that I've ever met have defined genderqueer the same way. So what I'm about to tell you is really just about how I define it. I define it in a way that makes me feel like I live in between all of the genders. I never wake up particularly feeling like a man or feeling like a woman. I feel basically all of it all at once. And so genderqueer is the word that I've used to describe how that feels to me. I do use the personal pronouns she, her, and hers, so that's totally fine, and please go ahead and use those when you reference me. I am Midwestern. I love cities. I'm a partner. I am an optimist, and optimism really shapes a ton of what I do and how I come across to people. I'm also middle class. I really love board games, similar to Sarah. I am an adventure seeker and a fun haver, and I am absolutely a cat lady. Those are my main identities. So now that we have told you a little bit about us and our identities, we want you to take a few minutes to think about you and what defines you. I'm going to ask a series of questions here, and you may choose to focus on some of the identities that we've shared with you, such as race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, ability status, gender identity, religion. All of these, totally fine. Or if you feel like you want to go a little bit deeper and think about the ones that aren't necessarily visible to everyone else, we'd encourage you to do that. So that being said, go ahead and think about these. Which part of your identity are you most aware of right now? Which part of your identity are you least aware of right now? And which part of your identity was most emphasized as you were growing up? See, when we think about identity, we have a tendency to think about one piece of it. We have a tendency to compartmentalize and to focus on one identity at a time. But this doesn't really reflect reality. Our identities are always complex and are always intertwined. Though Craig, Sarah, and I all identify as white, it feels different to each of us. We experience it differently because of our other identity factors. Focusing on one identity is like focusing on one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Audrey Lorde in 1983 was one of the earliest theorists to address this issue. As she said, "Within the lesbian community, I am Black. And within the Black community, I am a lesbian. Any attack against Black people is a lesbian and gay issue because I and thousands of other Black women are part of the lesbian community. Any attack against lesbians and gays is a Black issue because thousands of lesbians and gay men are Black." She concluded, "There is no hierarchy of oppression." Audrey Lorde and other Black feminists were some of the first to articulate this concept of intersectionality, a concept which embraces the understanding that we all encompass multiple identities and that all forms of oppression are ultimately linked. So today, we're going to explore how intersectionality can inform our understanding of student identity and our work with students.
So we each exist at the intersections of multiple identities. To push this even further, two people who have the same identity factors might experience things differently because one identity factor is more salient for them, more relevant or resonant in their life. This is something that can even change over time or in different situations. For example, someone who is gay might experience their sexual orientation as the most central aspect of their identity during the time that they come out. But this might fade in time in comparison to other factors later in life. Situationally, if you are the only woman in a room, you might experience your gender in an overwhelmingly salient way in that moment. In these ways, even fixed identity factors are somewhat fluid. So one of the most important things to realize when we talk about intersectionality is not just that we have multiple forms of identity, but that every category of identity has one form that is privileged and one that is oppressed. We all experience different elements of privilege and oppression because of our social group memberships. When we talk about privilege in this context, we mean a system of unearned advantage granted to somebody simply because of an identity characteristic. The person benefiting from privilege doesn't necessarily want or welcome their privilege, and they certainly haven't earned it. They receive it just because of the way their identity is read by others and by society. We're not talking about individual actions here. We're talking about systems. Men don't have to be sexist to benefit from being male, to benefit from sexism. White people don't have to be racist to benefit from being white, to benefit from racism. You see, privilege isn't about individual actions or desires. It is about systems of sexism, racism, classism, heterosexism, etc., that run beneath the surface of our society. Privilege and oppression are two sides of the same coin. Where there is oppression of one group, another group is benefiting from that oppression, and they are gaining privilege. Intersectionality reminds us that one can be quite privileged in many categories and still experience discrimination because of other identity factors. We all have multiple and sometimes shifting identities.
All right, so this figure is one of my favorites to use when talking about intersectionality. And this really illustrates the various kinds of privileges and oppressions that occur within different identity categories. This is also included in your handout. I know the font might be small on the screen for you, so hopefully you can take a closer look later. We're going to move closer to see the top half of these intersecting axes. As you see, every axis is marked with the ism that affects that category. For instance, racism, sexism, classism. And the identities on this top half of the figure, male, white, heterosexual, cisgendered, these are the ones that are granted privilege, that have unearned advantage in our current systems. When we move to the bottom half of the intersecting axes, we can see the identity factors that are oppressed. Okay, so I want you to think for a moment about your various identities and where they place you, and about the mixture of privilege and oppression that you experience. Remember that some of these identity factors are quite visible, some are hidden, and some may be easily misread. Now, our students read us as soon as they walk through the door. What are they seeing? How are they interpreting your identity and your mixture of privilege and oppression in relationship to theirs?
So Patricia Hill Collins, in her 1990 work, Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment, points out that oppression operates at three levels: the personal level, the community level, and the systemic level. Now, we're going to circle back to this in a little bit, but we wanted to put this framework in your mind so that you can focus on it.
One of the most important things about our identity factors is that they indicate our social location, or our standpoint. This graphic is a great representation of how differently we may view things, depending on where we are situated. If you're standing on the right side of the room, you would say that the object is a rectangle. If you're standing on the left side, you would say that the object is a circle. Neither of these answers is completely wrong, but neither accurately describes the cylinder in the room.
I have another more immediate example that's going to require a little bit of audience participation. All right, you ready? Okay, so I want each of you to take your dominant hand and point up at the ceiling, even higher than I can on this webcam, all right? So point up at the ceiling, and I want you to draw a circle clockwise in the air. Are you all doing it? All those fingers up, drawing a clockwise circle in the air above your head. All right, now while you keep your finger moving in a circle and keep your finger pointed up, I want you to bring your hand down. You're going to bend your elbow, bend your wrist, keep that finger pointing up, but bring that hand way down till it's about at your waist level. Now look down at your finger. What direction is your circle going in? What? Right? It's going counterclockwise. All right, so you drew a circle clockwise while looking up at it, but anyone looking down at that circle is going to see it moving in exactly the opposite direction from what you intended.
So, Dorothy Smith is one theorist who looks at the ways in which our social locations impact our view. She developed standpoint theory to describe the reality that what one knows is affected by where one stands in society. She says that 1, there is no objective knowledge. 2, no two people have the exact same view. And perhaps most importantly, 3, we must not take our personal standpoint for granted. We must examine it. Even more significantly, she points out that marginalized groups see systems of oppression more clearly than dominant groups do. In other words, the people whose identity factors fall in the bottom half of that earlier figure that we looked at, the one with all the axes, they observe and understand oppression more than the people at the top half of that figure do. Women see and understand sexism better than men. People of color see and understand racism better than white people do. LGBT people understand heterosexism and homophobia better than straight people. Transgender or genderqueer people see and understand the effects of gender privilege a heck of a lot better than cisgender folks, most of whom probably don't even know such privilege exists. This isn't because dominant groups do not want to see the oppression. It is because their social location is different in a way that literally masks these systems from their view. Dominant groups must put forth tremendous effort to see and understand the ways in which systems of oppression work. So, go back to that finger pointing at the sky and circling. Come on, you can literally do it again right now. Now, visualize that you are above your own finger, floating above the ceiling, and try to imagine what that circle would look like from that perspective. You see? It's much harder to do without seeing your finger moving down at your waist, where you can clearly observe the difference in motion.
So let's take another minute to reflect and think about our own standpoint with a little bit more reflection here. Just a few questions. So again, get your little reflector hat on. Which part of your privilege or which part of your identity gives you the most privilege? Which part of your identity makes you feel discrimination? Which part of your identity is usually hidden? And which part of your identity do people usually react to? See, as we think through the ways our identity is read, we consider how it is visible to others. We need to consider how our students see us and which identities are most visible immediately. It's all interrelated, so let's think here for a minute. Which part of your identity makes students feel most comfortable with you? and which part of your identity might make students feel uncomfortable with you. Here's the key question. Are you ready for this? Which students were you thinking about when you were answering those questions? And which students might have you been ignoring? You see, remember, all of us, all of our students, all of our peers, all of our colleagues, we can sometimes read incorrectly what those identities might look like because we have visible identities and hidden identities. Revealing more about ourselves and revealing more about our hidden identities is going to help us form stronger relationships with those around us. So what I'm asking you to do here is put on a brave face and embrace that vulnerability a little bit. This allows for a deeper connection, and it will definitely give you a stronger ability to put our students on a good path.
What we've talked about so far has focused really on the personal and the community levels. But moving to the system level, oppression operates by pushing people to replace their individual and cultural ways of knowing with the dominant group's ways of knowing. Right? So oppression functions by forcing individuals to adapt and to buy into the system in order to mitigate their own oppression. Systemic oppression is asking individuals to change in order to meet the needs of the dominant community.
So something to ponder here. In what ways does your university ask students to adjust to this dominant culture? Is this fair and necessary? Or is it oppressive and disempowering? So you might be sitting there wondering, what does this look like when somebody has to adjust to oppressive systems? Evangelina Holvino, in her work on oppression and organizational studies, locates several methods that organized groups use to adapt to the dominant culture. First, marginalized people learn to use anger appropriately. Notice that appropriately is in quotation marks here. That's because marginalized people use anger only in the ways that the dominant culture finds to be appropriate. Otherwise, they risk being labeled as an angry black man or a feminazi or someone who always has an unreasonable axe to grind. Second, marginalized people learn to balance between silence and outspokenness. This is closely related to the first point about anger. Third, at times, marginalized people need to retreat, to withdraw from oppressors into safe spaces. And fourth, marginalized people learn to code switch. They tactically shift consciousness to interpret the world from multiple identities and change their self-expression when interacting with different audiences. Now, code switching is something that we all do. Just imagine about how you talk differently to your best friend versus the provost of your university. However, people in non-dominant groups are forced to do this constantly, just in order to survive.
So now that you're thinking about these strategies that Craig just mentioned, moderating anger, balancing silence with outspokenness, retreating, and code switching, you may recognize these behaviors in what you do in your reactions, as well as what your students do when they react. The question is, have you interpreted them correctly? If you're being honest with yourself, the answer is likely not a chance. We see everything through our own lenses, and these lenses impact all of our actions and reactions. We've seen all of these strategies go awry. We've seen anger expressed inappropriately. We've seen silence relied on too heavily. We've seen outspokenness that makes people uncomfortable. So as we are looking back and reflecting on this, can we also recognize that maybe we viewed them as uncomfortable or inappropriate because they challenged the dominant system? So how can we learn to address these situations in a positive and learning-focused way? Well, we need to show our students that we care about them and that we support our institution's values, missions, and goals. We need to frame our conversations in a way that we know that they know that we want their success, because we do want them to succeed, right? We want them to be able to express their anger and express their frustration and talk about their emotions, but we want them to do it in a way that is going to be impactful in a good way and not put them in a bad situation. So we all make these assumptions, and that's a big part of this whole piece. Our brain is constantly making these snap judgments, and it's doing so based on our previous decisions and based on our previous experiences. Our brain is doing this because it's focused on survival. That's why we keep saying that it's natural. It is literally natural. Let me give you 3 quick examples. If we see an open flame, we think hot. If we see a smile, we think happy. Now, when I cross the street, I look left because it works for me when I'm here in the United States. However, when I was in London, this almost got me killed because I should have been looking right. So you see how our snap judgments, if we don't keep them in check, they can be pretty dangerous. So how do we go about staying on track? First, we need to recognize that there is an assumption that's happening. We need to admit that we can't help it and that it is natural. And then we need to evaluate that assumption to determine whether it's based in fact or whether it's based on what society is telling us or our biases or our generalizations. Now, see, this is the hardest part because sometimes what we think is based in fact is actually based on cultural biases or on our own upbringing or on our exposure to media. We have to be really aware of how our students are reacting to us, because that will give us a really, really big clue as to if we are interpreting this correctly. So we would say pay attention to their reaction and make sure you're paying attention to your gut too, because there are always, always, always clues if you're learning to look for them. So the last 2 key components here are to learn from what you're picking up in the area. And when you've learned, make sure that you're acting with intention. Because when we act with intention, we can see that bigger puzzle. And that is the bigger puzzle of intersectionality. It sounds hard, and it is, but it's really important. So, Craig, why don't you take us through what this might look like in an advising situation?
So when you have a student in front of you, you're immediately making snap judgments and processing information about them based on the assumptions you're making from cues, such as their physical appearance or the way they talk or the words they use. You know, they might have visible tattoos or be wearing a hijab or have dyed their hair in eccentric color. And it's safe to assume that you will be making some assumptions about this student based on how they are presenting themselves. The first step is to recognize the assumptions we're tempted to make. In all likelihood, we don't have enough information to understand the student. So what do? The main thing here is to recognize them as individuals and not to assume who they are, what they know or don't know, or what they need. It's really critical that we listen to students and to have them lead us to what it is that they need. So being open to this approach allows for the possibility of deeper relationships with our students. Relationships that are built on knowing them as individuals with multiple and intersecting identities. In short, we must center the experiences of people in marginalized groups, complicate identity discussions of and about our students, unveil the power that exists in our structures, and promote social justice and social change.
All right, so we're going to go into 3 quick stories, one from each of us, about how we've kind of used these techniques in real advising appointments in order to unpack students' conflicting identities. My story is something that happened just a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure, like many of the rest of you, you're involved in this kind of intense advising period for fall, right? And so I was having one of my regular registration appointments with a student that I don't know particularly well. I think I've only met her one other time. She came into my office, she sat down, I asked how things are going, she said things were fine. She presented as a very typical student for a pre-nursing student here at USI, female, white, really kind of nothing to distinguish her from some, well, I mean, there always is, right? But very typical for my advisees. So when we started planning her fall classes, one of the first things she said to me was, I can only have class Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday because I go home pretty much every weekend. All right, I don't know about you, but for me, immediately I had an assumption about the student. I thought to myself, she's not well attached to USI, she's a retention risk, she's homesick, she's going home because she has some boyfriend at home, something like that. And immediately my first instinct is to launch into my spiel about how important it is to stay at college and how there's so much that goes on in the weekends and that you can't adjust to being away from home unless you stay here, and student involvement and all the campus things. You probably know the story, right? You give this speech often. And I recognize right after I almost opened my mouth to say it, and then I thought, okay, Sarah, ask some questions first. And so I said, oh, it sounds like you go home a lot on the weekends. Why is it that you go home so much? And she said, my dad is really sick, and I need to go home and help him and help my mom. And immediately, it blew open my perspective on the student, right? And so I said, wow, you know, my partner, he has young onset Parkinson's, and I know how hard illnesses can be on a family. And she said, oh my gosh, you know, my dad, he has ALS actually. And we had this moment of bonding over, you know, neurological disorders. And then I said, how are you doing? And she said, well, I'm okay, but mostly I worry about my mom, and that's why I have to go home and give her a rest and all of these things. And we ended up having this lovely conversation about caregiving, about how hard it is to focus on forming your own life when you see all of this stuff happening with your parents and you want to be supportive. I gave her information about the counseling center, and in the end I helped her find a schedule that meant she would be able to go home and help out with her family, which was not my first instinct of something to do for her at all. I think it's not for most of us. And so that's kind of how this played out in real life with complicating a student's identity. Craig, would you share your story?
Yeah. So Florida International University, where I work, is the largest Hispanic serving institution in the nation, and many of my students are first-generation students. I advise in the English major, and some of the students with whom I work have to face obstacles that I never had to deal with. And so my story happened 3 years ago. I was working with an anxiety-ridden nursing major whose parents had immigrated from Honduras. He was miserable being a nursing student. He loved reading and writing about literature, and in fact, he snuck in a few English courses and convinced his parents that they were meeting requirements, even though they were not. So he fantasized about what it would be like to be taking exclusively English courses. Although I was kind of dismayed that his parents were forcing him to major in nursing after he had not been doing well as a pre-med student, I had to be very careful about what I said to this young man. Because he was grappling with tensions of following his heart and being a good, devoted son. And additionally, although he did not state this explicitly, he was making several remarks that led me to wonder if he was also grappling with his sexual identity. And so by the end of the appointment, I thought I had built him up and helped him to ignite some courage to approach his parents about his major change. So Drew, what's your story?
So my story happens with a woman walking into my office, a student walking into my office, who was failing 3 classes. And this was really surprising to her and to me because she was typically really on top of grades. And so I recognized in the moment that I was already making a lot of assumptions about why this might be occurring. Because again, I've seen a lot of students tank kind of out of nowhere. And so before I started anything, I knew that I was going to have to ask a lot of questions that were going to help me get to the bottom of whatever was going on. So when I asked her, one of my techniques is just to say, so what's your story? We're all storytellers at heart. And so I just say, all right, cool. So what's your story? And so I asked her what her story was. And she started pretty surface level at first. Oh, I've got a lot of things on my mind. Oh, I'm not really sure. I'm kind of questioning some things. And so immediately that makes my little feelers perk up and tune in a little bit more. And because she is being vague, but also sharing little bits and pieces, it gave me the cue that I could maybe ask a little bit more. And so I did. I kept prompting her, so tell me a little bit more about this, tell me a little bit more about that. What do you mean when you say you're questioning a lot of things? And it ended up coming out that she was really having a hard time with her gender and with her gender identity. And when she said this, she was kind of like a relief to just like, let it all out, like she'd been holding it in. And in holding it in, she had been questioning all of these things in her brain. And it was really, really affecting her schoolwork because she couldn't concentrate on studying. She couldn't concentrate on her classwork. She was doing all sorts of research on her own about all these things relating to gender and therefore couldn't focus on anything else. So at the end of that appointment, we had a 3-tiered action plan. The first thing that she was going to do was make sure that she got into the counseling center for an appointment there. The second thing that she was going to do was she was going to email all of her professors for the classes that she was failing and go in and talk to them about what she could do in order to get her back on track there. And then the last thing that she was going to do is that she was going to come in and speak with me on a more regular basis about her academics, but also how all of this was intertwined, about how her family issues were intertwined with her gender identity, and her gender identity was intertwined with all of these other types of her identity and her intersections of all of those identities. So that gives you 3 quick stories of what we did in our situations. And now what I want us to do is kind of walk you through the different things, the different aspects of ask, listen, share, and navigate, and how that relates to recognize, admit, evaluate, and learn. Sarah, why don't you get us kicked off?
That was a lot of verbs, Drew. There was like ask, listen, share, navigate, recognize. Okay, lots of verbs. And we want to make really clear, this is not like a step-by-step, first you do this, then you do that, and you have like a little checklist you're checking off, right? But this is just something that you can do habitually in order to make sure you are complicating your own understanding of the student. And so with my student, right, the first thing I did was to recognize I was making an assumption. I was assuming she wants to go home because she's homesick or she's got a boyfriend at home or something like that, and that it was not a good thing, that it was a bad thing for her. And then I had to admit, like, okay, Sarah, you've met this person like once before in your life. You have no idea what's going on. You better ask some things. And so I started asking. And as soon as she said, I go home because my dad has some health problems, she would have been very happy to just leave it there, right? It wasn't something that was easy for her to talk about. So she said, oh, my dad has health problems, so I go home a lot. And that could have been the end of it. I could have been like, oh, okay, well, let's move on. And instead, I thought, I think she wants to talk about this. I think I need to open that door wider. And so I decided to share, right? I shared about my partner and his health problems and how that, a little bit about how that affects me and my kids. And immediately we connected on a much deeper level than we had ever before, right? And we had this great conversation. And then we started talking about the issues and the problems, and I was able to kind of help her to navigate some of this very complicated stuff about who she was. So that was kind of how I talked through it with her and how I applied this. Craig, how about you?
So I mentioned earlier that I'm an academic and that I'm from a middle-class family and that I'm an orphan. But what I didn't mention is that I'm at least a third-generation college student. So access to education has never been an issue for me. And in this way, among many, I'm very privileged. My philosophy of education is built around passion and the belief that one will only be happy if he or she pursues their passion. I say this because it is really important for me to keep these various intersecting identities of my own in mind when I work with these students. So the first thing that I had to do is I had to be careful about how much I said about his parents, not only directly, but also through what I might accidentally imply. So this would not be a time that discussing how much support I received from my own parents would have been helpful. And so then secondly, I had to be careful about how much I pushed this idea of my educational philosophy of pursuing one's own goals and dreams. Although I really do believe that this is important still, this is not how all cultural, how people from different cultures always think. And so I had to be sensitive about the various different intersecting identities this student was carrying through this. And then finally, even though there were many hints about his sexuality, that was something that he was also probably struggling with, I had to be careful about how much I asked about that in this moment. This kid was overwhelmed beyond belief with some of these cultural issues and with his parents and what he wanted to do. And I just kind of felt like asking about this sexual identity would have just added another layer that would have just complicated things too much for this poor student. And it might have sent him over the edge. So Drew, what about you?
Right, so first I admitted that I was making an assumption, and then I spent a really, really long time in active listen mode. That's where I feel most comfortable when I'm in an advising situation, is just really listening and then every once in a while asking, tell me more. And then letting them tell me more and tell me more. And then at some point I realized that I don't want them to feel like it's a one-way conversation. And so I balance what can I tell them about me that is going to help them feel more comfortable in this situation. And so because I had talked through my own gender identity or thought through a lot of my own gender story, I shared some bits and pieces about how that has been impacting different areas of my life as well. So this balance of what can I tell without overplaying it was something that I tried to keep in mind. The thing that she was most grateful for, though, we had a conversation kind of talking a little bit about this, and the thing that she was most grateful for was that I acknowledged that the fact that she was questioning her gender identity had a huge impact on everything else, and that I gave her the space for that to be okay, and that I told her that I understood that gender identity doesn't just happen in a vacuum. You can't have these really big personal questions about one aspect of your identity and not think about everything else that's going on in your life. And so we need to think about how everything is interconnected before we can get you back on path. So see, everything is connected. You saw it in these three stories and how we decompress them and debrief them a little bit. There's really no steps to follow or boxes to check, as Sarah just said. Ask what you can, listen when you can, and make sure that you're sharing those stories together and then navigating those intersections together. When we act with intention, intersectionality all of a sudden becomes our lens. And that's when everything comes together.
So if we had one takeaway from this whole webinar, right, it would be to complicate your own understanding about student identity and to question your own tendencies to make judgments and snap judgments, come to conclusions too quickly by asking those questions and realizing that every one of us has a much more complicated picture of identity than you can see or know in one small advising appointment. And now we have time. I think we have plenty of time to answer some of your questions. And it's okay to have questions. It's okay to have lots of questions. Kitten has a lot of questions too.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was terrific. And a special shout out to Sparkle Kitty for making an appearance in the webinar. It's awesome. We do have questions from participants through the Q&A widget there, and also a few on Twitter. And so as we go through these, I invite our panelists, if they feel inclined, to jump in and answer. We have quite a bit of questions about purposeful advising, thinking about intersectionality and advisor-student ratio, how you do this when you have a full caseload. So let's start there. Drew, Craig, or Sarah, anyone want to talk about intentionality and intersectionality in a busy day, in a busy caseload?
Well, I'll start, and then other people can jump in if they want to. First of all, we are only human, right? And so on a day where you are seeing 15 students back to back, obviously you can't do all of this work in one advising session. And so I think that one of the things that's important, one of the things Drew said earlier about listening to cues and listening to your own gut, if we allow ourselves to, we usually know when a student actually wants us to ask more questions and follow up and probe a little deeper, and when they're happy to do the minimum and walk out of the office. And it's perfectly acceptable to say, you know, I really loved the 20 minutes we had today. I feel like we hardly scratched the surface, and there's so much more I want to help you with and learn about you. Can you come back in 2 weeks when I'm not in the middle of registration rush? It's perfectly fine to set up those parameters to continue the conversation later. And if something gets brought up that you don't have time to, I mean, you all know if it's a crucial thing and it's a life-threatening thing and they need to go right to the counseling center, you're going to do that. But otherwise, you can say, wow, I want to talk to you more about this. Open up your calendar. When can they come back? We can't always do it in every 20-minute appointment. Does anybody else want to add to that? Craig, Drew?
No, I think that's great.
Great reminder here that if on your campus advising is equated to a 15-minute registration appointment, these are going to be difficult conversations, and so all the more reasons to continually make connections with students and stress that idea that advising is relationship building, advising is year-round, advising is many things beyond course scheduling. So, but this time of year, schedules. So tricky, good. Okay, let's see, another question. How about from Twitter? How can we make our hidden identities, like orientation, for example, for some, more visible? And then a question about the issue of professionalism and how you balance all that. There are some assumptions there, but who would like to try that one?
Well, I think one of the things about that is to just be transparent about who it is you are. So if in the case of sexual orientation, I wouldn't hesitate to, you know, if I had a boyfriend, which I don't, but if I did, I would just speak very openly and use, you know, pronouns that suggested he was who he was. And I think a big part of that is kind of trying not to apologize for who you are. And I think that some people who are at least open-minded it'll be easier for them to accept you for who you are if you're not apologizing for who it is you are.
You can also, so first of all, I just want to say there's nothing unprofessional about being gay or lesbian, right? That, like, we are who we are. It's an identity. It's not about professionalism. You're not talking about your sexual practices. You're talking about your identity factor, and that is perfectly professional to do. If you have a family picture up, right? If you're not comfortable with that, or if you're in an environment that would be openly hostile to that, you can have a pride flag. You can have something that indicates you're an ally without revealing anything about yourself if you're more comfortable that way too. So that it's not unprofessional to be gay. That's just who you are.
Well, and I would also just add quickly that it's not unprofessional to be vulnerable, and it's not unprofessional to tell any sort of story. A lot of times we are under this impression that when we walk into the office, we need to be robots. We need to know all the answers. We need to talk about all of the things, and we need to we need to pack our emotions away. And that is just, one, unrealistic, and two, doesn't really speak to a comfortable environment. And so while there may be times where vulnerability is a little bit more tricky. And if you ever feel like you're moving into a more counselor-ish role, you might want to back up a little bit and say, you know what, I think that this conversation is getting pretty in-depth. And I'm happy to continue sharing our stories together, but I would also recommend that maybe you check out our counseling on campus or off campus if they feel more comfortable. I don't want anyone on this call to think that vulnerability in and of itself is unprofessional, because you can be vulnerable and you can show you care, and that ultimately leads to better advising communication, better advising conversations.
Yeah. And one of the things I'll add to that is that I don't want to get derailed here, but there is this stigma, right, about mental wellness in this country. And so I don't go into great depth about the content of my counseling sessions, but I am very open with students about the fact that I do go to counseling and that I don't feel like that's anything to be ashamed of. And my hope is that by speaking so openly, by being vulnerable, it will give them the courage to do this thing that maybe is not easy to do in this society.
Thank you. Okay, I think we hit a nerve there, and Drew, you were right on in terms of vulnerability. I think that some of our participants were, when they asked about counselor or advisor role, were picking up on telling of stories or the sharing more of yourself or the vulnerability. And is there anything, Drew, Craig, or Sarah, that you want to address to those who are wondering about that boundary between counselor and advisor? Is there anything else to clear up there?
I always remind students that I'm not a trained counselor, right? So I will say, you know, I want you to know I'm not a counselor. I'm really happy that we're talking about this together, and I love listening to this, but it seems to me like you might need more help than I can offer. And so I think as long as you've kind of reminded them of that and talked about the counseling center, it's also good practice to listen and respond as best we know how to, right? After drawing the parameters that you're not a trained and licensed counselor, if that made any sense.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Well, we had some good questions about power and power dynamics. Here's one from Twitter. How do you reconcile power dynamics in the advisor-student relationship when advisors expect dialogue, signal dialogue, and students are signaling or expecting service? And we have just a few more minutes for this one.
That question is really interestingly phrased, because when I think about power dynamics between advisors and students, I usually think that students think that advisors have all the power, right? And that they are, you know, supplicants coming in asking for something. And the way that question is phrased, advisors expect dialogue, right? We expect relationship building, but students expect service, like they're in the driving seat as the customer. That's just an interesting way to think about it to me, and I think that's a different way of considering the power dynamic. To me, you know, I'm a feminist in every aspect of my life, and in every single thing I do, I try to minimize hierarchy and minimize a power imbalance. And I do that by having really quirky stuff in my office, and by dressing on the casual side, and by having students call me Sarah, and you know, even by not being afraid to use their language back to them. If they are cursing, I'll curse back to them, right? I'm not going to curse on air because NACADA would kill me. If they are, you know, using slang, I'll try to use their slang. These, you know, stupid things like that, but things that kind of try to put us on a more level field. I want them to think I'm there to support them and to serve them in that way. So it doesn't bother me that they think that I'm there for them. I am there for them. Drew, Craig, anything?
Well, I think that's a terrific response to the question, but it also speaks to our various different identity factors. I probably am a little bit more on the conservative side when it comes to those conversations. But I also want to say that it depends on what students think advising is and the purpose of advising. We have some students who think, you know, we are there to provide a service, but I think that when students begin to meet with me and realize that it is, at least in my style, much more about a conversation and about exploring what they want to do with their lives, and much more dialogic, is that the right word? Then I think they come to know and come to expect what it is they're going to get from me. And what it is they're going to get from me is not, here are the 4 classes you need to take this semester. There you go. Have a good day. So it depends on us, and it comes back to our identities too.
Okay, super. Well, I think we have time for one more. I want to talk a little bit about this. One of the questions here about people who are living from a place of intersectionality. The question is, I feel my intersectionality sometimes makes me appear harsher instead of more understanding. I have lived the experiences, struggles as an international student. I do expect students to overcome difficulties and grow. Any advice on how I can use my intersectionality to empathize with students more and create an appearance that I am less harsh than I really do intend to be?
Sure. Well, I can take the lead on this and then let Sarah and Craig jump in too. I think a lot of it is how we frame it, right? And so if we start by just agreeing on the fact that it is a comfortable scenario and that we are sharing part of ourselves in a hope that we are making it more comfortable, that we're focusing on the care aspect of it, that goes a long way. I also, like I said, start in active listen mode, and as I'm listening to them, I'm trying to pick up on maybe 1 or 2 points that I can use my own experience on and really no more than that. Because I feel like if I start talking more and more and more about me, they're going to want to talk less and less and less about them. And so finding some piece of connection and then building on that piece, just small brick by small brick, like little Legos, right? Like putting little Legos together, and suddenly we've built like a giant, massive Lego structure. I'm a Lego nerd. That should be on my identities. Anyone else have a thought on that?
One of the things, it's a great question, and one of the things that I try to do is to remind myself continually that we are not involved in playing the struggle Olympics, right? Like there's no gold medal that goes to the person that's had the most struggle, and someone else may be going through something really small to me, but that doesn't mean it's not a valid struggle to them, and they get to experience that struggle however they experience it, right? So to put it on a very personal level, because that's part of this whole intersectionality thing, right? I have times where my partner is doing really, really badly with his Parkinson's disease. And I have a friend who will call me on the phone and she'll be like, I'm so, mad at my husband because he forgot to put the dog out or something. And I want to be like, quit your whining, right? But that's not helpful. And just because if your experience as an international student, you overcame these things, and that's wonderful, and it's not something to diminish, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it is a true and real struggle for the people that you're helping. So to kind of just always shift your framework to cultivate that, like, it's not a contest, and they don't have to do it the same way you did it, and they can feel as awful about something that to you would be small as you do about something that's really big. Hopefully that's clear. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. We are at the top of the hour, and I just want to say thank you to Sarah, Drew, and Craig one more time. Really terrific. We appreciate your time. Thank you to all participants who asked questions. If you would like to contact, there were some questions we couldn't get to. If you would like to contact our panelists, please see the handout. If you would like to send your questions to NACADA, they will be routed to me, and I will make sure that the panelists follow up, and that would be very important to us. So thank you to all participants. Thank you to all of our panelists. Our thoughts and good wishes are with the Cunninghams, who are not with us today. And thank you to everyone. This has been another, thank you Elisa, thank you Michelle, this has been another terrific NACADA webinar. Take care everybody.